have been looking at the kind of the history of magical thinking and where it starts to go wrong. And for my money, where it starts to go wrong is monotheism. I mean, if you look at the history of magic, you've got its origins in the caves. You've got its origins in shamanism, in animism, in a belief that everything around you, every tree, every rock, every animal, was inhabited by some sort of essence, some sort of spirit that could perhaps be communicated with. You would have had some central shaman or visionary who would have been responsible for channeling ideas that were useful to survival. By the time you reach the classical civilizations, you can see that this has formalized to a degree. The shaman was acting purely as an intermediary between the spirits and people. He was in his position in the village or community, I should imagine, very much like a spiritual plumber. You know, that people in the group would have had their own roles. The person who was best at hunting would have been a hunter. The person who was best at talking to the spirits, perhaps because he or she was a bit crazy, a bit detached from normal material world, then they would have been the shaman. And they would not have been masters of a secret craft. They would have simply been dispensing their information throughout the community, because it was believed to be helpful to the community. When you get the actual classical cultures emerging, this has been formalized so that you've now got pantheons of gods, and each of those gods will have a priest caste that will act to a certain degree as intermediaries who will instruct you in the worship of that god. So the relationship between humans and their gods, which could be seen as the relationship between humans and their highest selves, that was still a very direct one. When Christianity comes in, when monotheism comes in, then all of a sudden you've got a priest caste moving between the worshipper and the object of worship. You've got a priest caste becoming a kind of spiritual middle management between humanity and the divine within itself that it is seeking. You no longer have a direct relationship with the Godhead. The priests don't really necessarily have a relationship with the Godhead. They've just got a book that tells you about some people who lived a long time ago who did have a direct relationship with the Godhead. And that's all right. You don't need to have miraculous visions. You don't need to have gods talking to you. In fact, if you do have any of that stuff, you're probably insane. You know, in the modern world, that stuff doesn't happen. The only people who are allowed to talk to gods, and in a very kind of one-sided way, are priests. Monotheism is, to me, a great simplification. I mean, the Kabbalah has a great multiplicity of gods, but at the very top of the Kabbalistic diagram, the tree of life, you have this one sphere that is absolute God. The monad, something that is indivisible, you know? And all of the other gods, and indeed everything else in the universe, is a kind of emanation of that God. Now, that's fine. But it's when you suggest that there is only that one God at this kind of unreachable height above humanity, and there is nothing in between, you're limiting and simplifying the thing. I mean, I tend to think of paganism as a kind of, as an alphabet, as a language. It's like all of the gods are letters in that language. They express nuances, shades of sort of meaning, or certain subtleties of ideas. Whereas monotheism, it tends to be just one vowel, and it's just something like, ooh, it's this monkey sound. You can almost imagine the gods becoming frustrated, contemptuous that with all this richness of spiritual concepts that are available, why reduce it to one plaintive single note that the utterer does not even understand? The alchemists had two components to their philosophy. These were the principles of solve and coagula. Solve was basically the equivalent of analysis. It was taking things apart to see how they worked. Coagula was basically synthesis. It was trying to put the disassembled pieces back together so that they worked more efficiently. These are two very important principles which can be applied to almost any thinking culture. There has recently, in literature for example, been a wave of postmodernism, deconstructionism. This is solve. Perhaps it is time in the arts for a little more coagula. Having deconstructed everything, perhaps we really should be starting to think about putting everything back together. Spiritualism was the natural state of human thinking up until the Renaissance and the subsequent age of reason that grew out of it. Our original way of seeing the world was as a place entirely inhabited by spirits, where everything had its indwelling essence, where everything was in some sense sacred, including ourselves. The age of reason changed all that. While it's inarguable that reason brought many great benefits and was a very necessary stage of our development, unfortunately this led to materialism, where the physical material world was seen as the be-all and end-all of existence, where inevitably we were seen as creatures that had no spiritual dimension, that had no souls, living in a soulless universe of dead matter. In the mid-1980s, I was asked by an American legal institution known as the Christic Institute to compile a comic book which would detail the murky history of the CIA from the end of the Second World War to the present day, covering things such as the heroin smuggling during the Vietnam War, the cocaine smuggling during the war in Central America, the Kennedy assassination, and other highlights. What I learned during the frankly horrifying research that I had to slog through to accomplish this was that yes, there is a conspiracy. In fact, there are a great number of conspiracies that are all tripping each other up, and all of those conspiracies are run by paranoid fantasists and ham-fisted clowns. If you are on a list targeted by the CIA, you really have nothing to worry about. If, however, you have a name similar to somebody on a list targeted by the CIA, then you are dead. The main thing that I learned about conspiracy theory is that conspiracy theorists actually believe in a conspiracy because that is more comforting. The truth of the world is that it is chaotic. The truth is that it is not the Jewish banking conspiracy or the grey aliens or the 12-foot reptiloids from another dimension that are in control. The truth is far more frightening. Nobody is in control. The world is rudderless. The substance that has most effect upon our culture and upon our lives is completely invisible. We can only see its effects. This substance is information. Science started out as an offshoot of magic. The two became completely divorced from each other and bitter enemies, although I tend to think that at the present moment the two are growing back together again. I was reading recently that people at the cutting edge of quantum physics believe that information is a super weird substance, to quote the actual phraseology, which underlies everything in the universe, which is more fundamental than gravity or electromagnetism or the two nuclear forces. This would tend to suggest that our entire physical universe is the secondary byproduct of a primal information, or, to put it in more magically acceptable terms, in the beginning there was the Word.